Hey there, everybody. PTPop here with all four lobes of my brain securely bound behind my back, and welcome to another episode of PTPop, a mind revolution, where I lead you out of the rabbit hole, one grain of truth at a time. Today, I've got a great show for you today. I've had Mike on the show a couple times before. He's had me on his show. Today, we're talking with Mike Williams, the extraordinary Beatles conspiracy researcher. And he's known worldwide. His presentations and interviews on the McCartney and the Beatles conspiracy have achieved over 5 million views worldwide. You know, I was just trying to draw the line, the connection between Tavistock, Adorno, and the Beatles, and just kind of break it down. Because if it weren't for you, I would have no idea either that person or that entity existed. And I've read more of the Billy Shear's book.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating. It's just fascinating, especially what you see what's going on with the lies in our own government right now, with the attempted Trump's assassination and there's different spins on that story and how they try to manipulate everybody and turn it into a thing. So that's kind of what I was trying to do with the Tavistock and things like that.
It's all controlled, Peter. At the end of the day, that's what we have to understand, and I've been talking about this for a very long time. There's very little, if anything, in our world, in our reality, that is organic or natural.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, your family is organic and natural if you have children and so on. I'm talking about the interactions that we have with institutions, with politics and the media, the military, academia, all of that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Is completely controlled because there is an agenda. There is a one world agenda. And a lot of people used to think that that type of talk was from conspiracy theorists and tinfoil hat wearers. And now what's happened is so much is being rolled out now by the controllers that they're no longer hanging in the shadows. They're coming out into the open and they're talking about their plans and they're talking about where they want to go. And I point people to the World Economic Forum. Go to their website. If you think what I'm saying is crazy stuff, go read their website because they're telling you everything that's on their agenda and where they think they're going.
Let's start with Tavistock. What is that? And, where did it come from? And, I'll let you take it from there because I think that's fascinating. Tavistock is just a fascinating entity in and of itself.
We have to understand, first of all, that there is a internationalist organization and structure. That's what I try to explain that to my audience, that whenever you see the word world or international in front of some organization, that is part of the one world controlling apparatus.
Okay.
So as an example, we have the United Nations, United Internationalist, One World. We have the World Bank. We have the World Court. We have the Bank of International Settlements. We have the International Monetary Fund. We have organizations like the World Economic Forum, the Bilderbergs, the Trilaterals, the Council on Foreign Relations. These are all deep state internationalist organizations that are controlling the world across all ends of the spectrum.
And they're run by billion, if not trillionaires, right? They're the richest people in the world run these institutions.
Yes. So you have, it's all tiered. So the higher you go up the pyramid, the more shadowy and the darker these people become. As an example, one of a very powerful yet very secret society is the Black nobility. So very few people know who the Black nobility are, who are members of the Black nobility, but they sit toward the upper tier of the pyramid.
Mm-hmm.
So what you have is this system is run by occultists. So when I say occultists, I'm not just talking about sorcerers, although there are sorcerers and witchcraft, those types of things are involved. What we're talking about is it's the hidden hand. So a cult or cultism simply means something is hidden. So we don't know about it. So they go about their business with this hidden hand, and what they present to the public is nothing more. It's a veneer, and they tell you that that's your reality.
Yeah.
Behind that veneer, behind that curtain, there's the great Oz, and there's all of these levers and buttons and all of these mechanisms that they're pulling and pushing every single day to manipulate the world to march toward their end goal. Their end goal is a one world government, one world religion. And they have been at it for a very, very long time. And I've argued that really the internationalist system that's in place today really has been alive and well, and really got a lot of traction after World War II. It existed before that, clearly, but it was after World War II that they set their sights on the United States. Before World War II, they were focused on Europe. So it's divide and conquer. So during World War I, that's where they were focused on making the changes they needed to make within the nation states in Europe. And then once they got to World War II, then the bullseye was on the U.S. So you have this kludge of secret societies, and I oversimplify it by saying it this way, but it's an effective way to explain it. Think of it as the overarching secret society is Freemasonry. And then within Freemasonry, you have multitudes of secret societies that work together, and they have a common goal. The common goal is to control. It's world domination. It's world control. And the one thing that the controllers are very good at, that we, the masses, are not very good at, is they are able to set aside their differences for the larger goal. So it's not to say that they don't have disagreements and there aren't factions that have friction between them within the pyramid of power, but they're able to sit down and say, okay, look, let's keep our eye on the ball. Let's get into the end zone. And then once we're there, once we achieve what it is we're looking to achieve, then we can sit at the table and we can hash through what our differences are, and we'll get that resolved. Whereas most of the population does the exact opposite. Nobody wants to march into the end zone until all of their idiosyncrasies and their differences have been resolved beforehand. And then, hypothetically, they will move forward. But as you know, since all of these different positions and ideas and thoughts and positions that people have can never be resolved satisfactorily to everybody's satisfaction, they're not going to move the ball forward. And again, I'm talking about the masses in general, but the controllers themselves are very, very good at being able to set aside their differences and move forward.
Okay.
And Tavistock is part of that internationalist structure. So it's really not that complicated. Just think of it as it's a world government that's in place. And so the world government has its courts, it has banking for the monetary system, it has the United Nations. Well, like every corporation, they have to have their marketing, sales, and propaganda arm, right? They have to have that. So think of Tavistock in that vein. And their job is to social engineer the masses to formulate the execution of the strategies that either they develop themselves or the strategies that come down to Tavistock. So above them, there's the Committee of 300, and a great book on that, and I highly recommend people read it, is a book by John Coleman. It's titled The Committee of 300, The Conspirators' Hierarchy. And Dr. Coleman released this book in the early 1990s. I think it was 92 or 93. So it's about 30 years ago. And what you'll find is when you go through this book, it will hit you that he's talking about a level of control, Peter, that existed 30 years ago that will boggle your mind. And now it's 30 years later.
Oh, yeah.
It's also in this book where he talks about the Beatles being a creation of Tavistock. Now, this book is not about the Beatles. I always have to explain this to folks. The book is about the Committee of 300 and the controlling system, the controlling matrix.
Okay.
But
so the idea of Tavistock creating the Beatles wasn't your idea. You were turned on to it by this book.
Yeah. So what happened was in the memoirs of Billy Shears, going back maybe 2 or 3 editions ago, there was a blurb on page 350 going into page 351. And I don't know if those words are still on that page anymore. And that's
Might not
book.
be. Yeah.
Yeah. I think mine was maybe the 2018 edition, maybe. I'm not really sure. But Tom has made some updates to the book, Tom U. Harriet, who's the author / encoder. So I don't know if some of the wording and the pages have shifted around a little bit. But in any case, back when the edition I read on page 350 and 351, at the very bottom of page 350, I'll never forget this, Pete, the narrative said that George Martin was going to take their little songs, talking about the Beatles songs, their little songs, and make them famous and make them great. And when I was reading the book, I thought, well, that's kind of an interesting way to explain it. He's going to take their little songs. So in other words, the narrative was marginalizing the Beatles' songwriting. And then on the next page, it talked about the Committee of 300 and the snitch. So, I mean, I knew of the Committee of 300, and I'm looking at, and I'm reading the paragraph, and I'm thinking, the snitch? Well, I knew that the Committee of 300 was written by John Coleman. I hadn't read the book yet, but I had watched interviews that John Coleman did back in the day. There's one, in fact, that I have on my main YouTube channel. I think it goes back to the late 90s, maybe early 2000. And so I thought, is Memoirs talking about John Coleman in the book, The Memoirs of Billy Shears? So I went and bought the book, The Committee of 300, and I read it, and lo and behold, there it was. So there's about maybe 8 to 10 mentions in the book about Tavistock and the Beatles. And Coleman talks about how Theodore Adorno was heavily involved in the writing of the Beatles' music. So this is something that he talks about. And again, I want to reiterate, the book is not about the Beatles. It's about the Committee of 300 and Tavistock and the controlling system. But because the Beatles are such a huge psychological operation, they get notable mention whenever Tavistock was discussed in the book.
So who is Theodore Adorno, and what is his relation to Tavistock? Is there a correlation between the two?
Yeah. So the first thing we need to do is let's just back up and understand Tavistock, and then we'll get into Adorno. So Tavistock was an outgrowth of Wellington House, which was the propaganda arm for the British military during World War I. So Wellington House was responsible for coming up with all of the propaganda. To their first order of business was to get the British people to agree to build consensus to go to war with Germany. And this was a very tall order because the British had no reason to want to go to war with Germany. They viewed the Germans as their neighbor, and they had no issues with the Germans. And that was a big problem in the very beginning of World War I because the British were trying to march forward. They were trying to instigate the war with Germany. And the British people were stepping back and saying, we don't support this. It's the same thing that happened to the United States in World War II. And Tavistock had their hands in that as well with FDR. So Tavistock was given the mission, or Wellington House was given the mission of getting the British people on board to build consensus to go to war. And through a massive propaganda campaign, which included flyers and pamphlets saying that the Kaiser and his military were bayoneting babies and all that stuff. I mean, none of that stuff was true, but it's the same type of thing we saw with the United States during the Iraq War, where they had the diplomat's daughter at the time, and nobody told us it was a diplomat's daughter, who said that the Iraqis were taking babies out of incubators and killing them. That never happened either. So it's a very similar story. So they built this entire propaganda program, and it was highly successful. And then once the war was over, the Wellington House essentially just transitioned over to the Tavistock Clinic. Now, when it was the Tavistock Clinic, and this was 1921, if I recall, what they were doing was taking soldiers from World War I who were traumatized from the war, shell-shocked, and they were bringing them in for psychiatric evaluation and treatment.
Mm-hmm.
Very dubious. So they basically had established themselves a base of patients or subjects that they were going to experiment on from a psychiatric and psychological perspective. Now, this continued on for a very long time. Tavistock, again, as the clinic, was established in 1921, and they are alive and well today. So we're in 2024. And what I've explained to my audience is Tavistock has been in the business of social engineering and mass mind manipulation, behavioral modification for 120 years. That's a long time to be majoring something. So they infuse themselves into every facet of governments, into politics, into the corporate world, into the military, into academia. I mentioned about World War II with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. His job too was to try to get the United States to go to war in World War II, because before that, the United States was not interested in going to war, because at the time it was viewed as Europe's war. We didn't have any business being over there. So Tavistock deployed its agents. One of them was Edward Bernays, who's considered the godfather of propaganda, to the United States. And they started formulating the propaganda program under FDR to get the American public to enter into the war. And it was the same thing. We had all of these pamphlets, and remember the movie shorts when people would go to the theater about the evil Germans and all of this. And, and later on it was the Japanese. This was all the doing of Tavistock. They have been at it for a very long time. They are extremely good at it. And if you go to their website, it looks like motherhood and apple pie. If you read it, I mean, you know, just for the benefit of the world and, and all that stuff. But when you get into what they're really about, and let me just do this for the audience, Pete. There's two great books that I recommend for people who want to get acclimated and to get a baseline on Tavistock. The first one is this book, which was released in 2008. It's Daniel Estulin's book, Tavistock, the Tavistock Institute, Social Engineering the Masses. And the other book is another John Coleman book, a fantastic book. Coleman's exceptionally good at writing his books because he has 30-something chapters in here, but he writes his chapters very short and sweet. He gets right to the point. Okay, so it's not real dense. He makes his points and then he moves on. But this book, Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, Shaping the Moral, Spiritual, Cultural, Political, and Economic Decline of the United States of America. This is a very, very good book. And another book leading into all of this, because we're going to talk about cultural Marxism, is another book by John Coleman. He was very prolific with his writing. And this one is titled The Rothschild Dynasty.
Has Coleman passed on?
I believe if he's very old, if he's still alive. The last time I checked, he was in his 80s. And this goes back a few years ago. So I tried to locate him. I tried to get a contact for him going back about, I would say 4 years ago. And I couldn't find anything. His website was defunct because he's almost the same age as my mom. Mom's 89. So, he said what he had to say, and you get older and you move on. So I don't know if he's still alive.
Okay. It'd be cool to have him on as a guest. So
it'd be great.
For yourself,
a wealth of knowledge, but I could not find a good contact for him. If somebody out there is listening to this and has a good contact for Dr. Coleman, and if he's still alive, please feel free to contact me or Pete, and we'll connect with him.
Excellent.
So that's Tavistock, and I went through it real quick, and I have some notes here. Let me just read this here.
Okay.
So they have far-reaching influence throughout governments, non-government organizations, otherwise referred to as NGOs. A lot of NGOs operate through the United Nations. The private business sector, so this would be your corporate world. Public and private institutions, mass media, global think tanks, the military, education, and of course the music and entertainment industry. So they have their hooks into everything.
Everything, yeah.
So their methods to overcome obstacles is social engineering, otherwise known as brainwashing, conditioning, and indoctrination. They look to reshape and redefine values, morals, beliefs, and ethics, and to create a new culture. So the culture that most people live in today and embrace is pop culture. Mm-hmm. So pop culture was delivered to us by Tavistock and the Frankfurt School from the cultural Marxists.
Okay.
It's not our true culture. Our true culture would be our ancestral culture. So as an example, I'm Italian and Welsh. So from my mom's Italian side, we would have Italian traditions. And what the controllers have done was to erase and to get all of that ancestral and family traditions off the table, because that's in their way. They need everybody to be on the same page. So what they look to do is homogenize society and the culture. And pop culture does that. So, what's pop culture? Pop culture is Netflix, it's hamburgers, it's hot dogs, it's beer, it's ball games. That's a far cry from our heritage and our ancestral culture. So they look to break down traditional structures, and we'll get into this. So when we talk about traditional structures, we're talking about family values, beliefs, and institutions, such as religious institutions. They have had an all-out war on Christianity because they need Christianity out of the way, and we'll get into that in a little bit. They implement a diametrically opposing framework to the existing structures. So this would be like the counterculture of the 1960s would be a good example of that. Free love, drugs, androgyny, multiculturalism, moral equivalency. Who's to say that that's wrong or who's to say that that's right? Everybody has a different perspective. And we'll get into that too. That gets into critical theory and the Frankfurt School.
Just real quick, I just want to mention that when I think of the 60s and the hippie movement, I was just a little kid. I was like 2-3 years old. But when I look back in the history books, it seems like it just appeared out of nowhere.
Yeah.
And that to me is part of it. They engineered it to come in at this time when the youth was vulnerable, was spearheaded by the Beatles. At first, maybe it was Elvis, but then the Beatles kind of blew the doors open.
Right.
And everybody started growing their hair and doing drugs. And then the hippie movement just appeared. All of a sudden people got their hair down to their waist and they're smoking dope. And I just, even as a kid, I'm like, where did this come from, and why are people doing this? And I even questioned things when I was really little, but I think you're getting to that. I think that's kind of what you're alluding to.
Yeah, it's all scripted and orchestrated. It's engineered to happen, and we'll get into that too, because what we'll do is we'll talk about the Frankfurt School, and then we'll get into the Beat movement, which was the precursor leading into the Beatles. So everything has a step on the ladder, Pete. They just don't dive into something. So it's very incremental and it's very methodical how they go about their change, because if they go about it too abruptly, then people are going to turn around and say, oh, hold on a second, what's going on here? So they want to build it nice and slow so that you acclimate and assimilate. And they've made a lot of advances over the years. Decadence is something else that is very, very key to the Frankfurt School and Tavistock and cultural Marxism. And of course, they want to lower critical thinking. And this is all done through your media and your television shows, just to relegate people to just nonsense stuff. In Daniel Eshelman's book, he makes some very good points. And two of them that I just latched onto. He said, one of the things that Tavistock is really, really good at is creating cults. And the reason why the creation of cults is important, because cults have leaders and then you have cult followers. So even things that don't seem like a cult are actually a cult. As an example, religion is a cult. Following your bands, like the Beatles, is a cult. And people who follow certain entertainers and celebrities, there's a cult mentality. There's a pop culture. So the word culture has the word cult in it. And so they create all these different buckets and factions because they know that one piece is not going to fit all. So they create lots of buckets and lots of cults. But at the end of the day, they're all organized so that these cults with their cult followers march in the same direction. Even if it's not obvious, but if you take a look years down the line, you're going to see, hey, they're all turning this way, right? And we'll get into that in a little bit as well. The common thread that we'll find with Tavistock, with the Frankfurt School and cultural Marxism is a common thread of, I'll mention Tavistock in a second. I said there was 2 points that Daniel Eshelman made. Let me go to that now. The other point that Daniel made is Tavistock looks to relegate the adult mind down to that of a child's thinking. So that's where we lose the critical thinking faculties. Everything becomes very based in emotions, very reactive. People are not thinking rationally and logically. They're not listening. And to a point, counterpoint, they're very reactive. They're very emotional. And a lot of times what happens is they lash out. They become angry. And even there's times when it resorts in violence.
It's like a tantrum, like a child having a tantrum.
It's like, right, they're having a tantrum. And one of the reasons why they love this is because, and we see this now taking place in the UK, in England, where they're having all these riots. All of these riots that are taking place, they've all been orchestrated and instigated with agent provocateurs, because from the controller's mindset, the more out of control something is, the more they can come out and say, we have to institute control. So, it's problem, reaction, solution. So they create the problem. The solution's going to be, reaction's going to be people are very upset and angry, and they're distraught and they're nervous about what's going on with all this violence. And then they present the solution. It's like, oh, well, you know what? We can squash this. We will need more surveillance, a bigger police state. This is why we need things like digital ID passports, so we know who everybody is, and this is why we need facial recognition software. Right. So they create all of this stuff, and so I was going to say the common thread with all of this, when we talk about Tavistock, Frankfurt, and cultural Marxism, is there's a psychological piece to this, behavioral modification, as I mentioned before, and hedonism. So those two things go together. Behavioral modification, psychological manipulation, and hedonism or decadence. Because the hedonism and the decadence, what that does is that breaks down society, breaks down society norms. And from the perspective of the controllers, this is, they view this as an alchemical process. So in order to bring about the new, you have to eliminate the old or the existing. And this is a tenet that Crowley teaches as well. He talks about, in order to bring in the new, nothing from the previous can exist.
So
you
to
have
undermine,
to erase it.
So undermine the Christian values, they turn the population into hedonists. So we focus more on self-pleasure, pornography, sexual gratification, booze, drugs, and we become so immersed in that. It's a form of control, and they can do what they want with us. And you're leading to that, but that's like I've seen it firsthand. I look around me, like everybody's wrapped up in their Teslas and there's a Dunkin' Donuts that opened up the street down from me. We've got 2 Dunkin' Donuts now for some reason. The line of people was down the street on the sidewalk for donuts and coffee. I'm like, why? I mean, but because they just think it's just donuts and coffee. But that's a whole nother thing. But it's kind of the same thing. They distract us with sugar and fast food and food deserts and things.
That's the pop culture.
Yeah.
Exactly. No, you're right on point, because we had a similar situation going back a few years ago when they opened a Krispy Kreme in my town, and I can care less about Krispy Kreme donuts.
Yeah.
They're donuts, right?
Yeah.
And they have coffee. So what? So does 500 other stores.
Yeah.
Right within the vicinity, and it was the same thing, Pete. There were people lined up. You would think that they were handing out money.
Oh yeah.
And I could not believe the line all around the Krispy Kreme. And
really?
this is the problem. Yeah. It was unbelievable. It was the same thing. And this is the problem that we have with society. And the problem is very few people take the time to step back and assess it, because they're so wrapped up in all of the materialistic goodies that are presented to them on any given day, like you said, whether it be donuts, whether it's going to be TV sets or the new phone or the new car, whatever. People are completely caught up in this materialistic world.
Yes, yeah.
And what that does is that pulls people away from their spiritual connections. And we've gotten to the point now where a lot of times when we talk about spiritual connections, and when I'm talking about spiritual connections, I'm talking about connection back to source, the creator, God, back to the divine, understanding more about metaphysics. You're contemplating what your purpose is in life. Why are you here? Are you actually here to stand on line at the Krispy Kreme because a new store opened up? Is that really why you're here? So they don't want any of that, because they don't want people philosophizing. They don't want people being introspective. They don't want any of that stuff. They want everything to be at a very basic, at a veneer, like I mentioned before, very topical, and just to go about your homogenized life and just go with the flow.
Yeah.
Don't stir up any problems. So anyway, so that's Tavistock, and going through some of the attributes of what it is that they bake into their agendas and into their initiatives. The Beatles were a psychological operation, a massive psychological operation, as was the entire British invasion. Now, Tavistock is out of London, and there's a good reason why they refer to the British invasion as the British invasion. It was because it was the British secret societies, along with secret societies across the world, including those here in the United States, who were looking to usurp the current system and to begin the process of breaking it down and implementing their one world order. Now let's talk about the Frankfurt School, and that will lead us into Theodore Adorno.
Okay.
Okay, so Tavistock originates out of Wellington House, and there's a history before that as well, but I won't get into that. We'll just start with Wellington House going forward. That's 120 years of history. I think for the purposes of our show, that'll suffice.
Yeah.
The Frankfurt School was established in 1923. So think of it as 2 years after Tavistock formed the Tavistock Clinic. Coincidence? No, not really. I should also mention that Tavistock, Sigmund Freud was their poster child, and I mentioned Edward Bernays was also part of the Tavistock system. Now, the Frankfurt School was not a school in itself. It was really an adjunct to Frankfurt University, and it was comprised of Marxist intellectuals at Frankfurt University in the 1920s and the 1930s. So think in terms of you had this think tank of Marxist intellectuals that were operating for about 2 decades. And when we talk about the Frankfurt School, they're connected at the hip with Tavistock, as is the Fabian Society, which was another secret society out of Britain that was closely aligned with the Frankfurt School, with Tavistock, and all of these other secret societies and these organizations that were looking to implement a one world order. And many of them, like the Fabians, were into eugenics big time, as were the Frankfurt School group too, but the Fabians more so, based upon my research. They were heavily into the concept of eugenics or depopulation. So when you read about the Frankfurt School, of course, when you go to Wikipedia and you go to any of the online mainstream resources, it's like Tavistock's website. It's going to read like motherhood and apple pie. You're going to think, well, this doesn't seem so bad, And they're going to talk in terms of being altruistic, an egalitarian world where everything is equal. There is no class structure. This is the type of stuff that you're going to read. So the question, when I was reading all this, and I was reading the books that were really digging in, the question I asked was, well, was the Frankfurt School really altruistic and egalitarian, or were they gaslighting us? And I came to the conclusion that it was a lot of gaslighting. So one of the approaches that the Frankfurt School was engaged in is to make people think illogically. So if I say black, you say white. If I say left, they say right. So if I say the sky is blue, they'll say, no, it's really not, it's green.
Yeah.
Right? And the objective of the Frankfurt School and a lot of these elite organizations was to continue to push that type of dialectic in order to slowly get people to question their own logic and ability to reason. So Bertrand Russell, who is a British elitist, he died in the 1970s, a big-time one world, new world order type. Here's a quote. The objective is to produce an unshakable conviction that snow is black. And that's what I was talking about. Now, what the Frankfurt School, the way they looked at that and said, well, if we get to gray, we win. So Bertrand Russell is saying, if I can get you to think that snow is black, the Frankfurts were saying, we'll settle with gray, because once you think that snow is gray, we've won.
Yeah, you've won.
Right? The war for the mind.
They do it all the time on the news.
All the time. Well, if we go to the whole thing with transgender and telling us that a child's gender is not defined when they're born, that they have time to decide that. That's a perfect example of what we're going to get into, which is critical theory from the Frankfurt School. That's a perfect example of telling people that snow is black or that men could lactate.
Yeah.
It's the same thing.
Yeah.
So there were more than four, but there were four primary players at the Frankfurt School. There was Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, and Erich Fromm. And they were all cultural Marxists. And they had a different approach to Marxism, Pete, than what was experienced before. So during the Russian Revolution, which was really the Bolshevik Revolution during the World War I period in Russia, that was Lenin Marxism. Lenin Marxism is denoted by violence. So they're going to achieve their goals, their Marxist goals, worldwide Marxism, by implementing war and violence. So they're going to take we're going to hit you over the head with a hammer approach to be able to get Marxism at a worldwide level. Well, the Frankfurt School cultural Marxists, Horkheimer, Adorno, Marcuse, and Fromm, these guys turned around and said, bad approach, because you're not going to win anything that way. You can't do it through violence. So you have to subvert from within. So it's a much more incremental and methodical approach to do it this way, but it's in the end, it's far more effective because people won't even realize that they're being subverted and commandeered. They will just go along to get along, and a decade will go by, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years, and before you know it, you're in a completely different system because people completely lost perspective on the baseline. They don't remember the baseline anymore. So if we take a quote from Max Horkheimer, and I pulled this a while back. This comes from Henry Mackow's website. And by the way, Henry is Jewish, for those that,
Well, Adorno was too, right?
Yes, they all were. They were Jewish cultural Marxists. This is something that people don't like to talk about it because whenever you talk about the Jewish control system, people recoil.
Yeah. And they call you a Nazi.
And there's no reason to recoil because it is what it is. There's no problem with saying you talk about a Catholic control system, or you talk about Christianity, or you talk about Hindus or Buddhists. But if you say the word Jew or Jewish, people get really nervous. And like I said, they recoil. So Max Horkheimer said the following. This is a quote. And Horkheimer was one of the leading Jewish Marxists of the Frankfurt School, which pioneered cultural Marxism. The revolution, and he's talking about the Marxist revolution, won't happen with guns. Now, remember, they were saying, hey, Lenin had it all wrong with his guns and his violence. Rather, it will happen incrementally, year by year, generation by generation. We will gradually infiltrate their educational institutions and their political offices, transforming them slowly into Marxist entities as we move towards universal egalitarianism. So they keep talking about, universal egalitarianism, but that's really not what they're talking about. I mean, really, it's to pigeonhole the population, the masses, into a one world Marxist state. That's what they're looking to do. And interestingly enough, back in the early 1900s, this document came out. It's called the Protocols of Zion. And I've had this for many years. It's not easy to find on the internet anymore because they don't want anybody reading it.
Okay.
But what it is it's a document which is basically the game plan of the Jewish Marxists and how they're going to go about changing the world. And as an example, I'll read only some of the bullets here, not all of them.
Okay.
Place our agents and helpers everywhere. Take control of the media and use it in propaganda for our plans. Start fights between different races, classes, and religions. Use bribery, threats, and blackmail to get our way. Use Freemasonic lodges to attract potential public officials. Appeal to successful people's egos. Money. Appoint puppet leaders who can be controlled by blackmail. Replace royal rule, in other words, monarchies.
How old is this document? How old is it?
This goes back to, I think it was 1904, 05.
Okay. All right.
So let's just say about 120 years ago.
Yeah. Okay.
So I'm not going to go read through all of this. It's not a very big document, but everything is here. Now, when you read it, you're going to see the game plan unfold right before you, and you're also going to see that a lot of this stuff is already well underway, if not already baked into the cake, you know?
Yeah.
Some things are still an open switch, but it's very important for people to read stuff like this, because when you read the Protocols of Zion and then you get into the Frankfurt School, you quickly realize that they have the exact same ideology. The exact same ideology.
So they must be working together.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's
all part of the same thing.
It's a long-term ideology that has been in place for a long time by communists. And communism is a Jewish ideology. A lot of people don't know that either, but it is. So now with the Frankfurt School, they came up with what is referred to as critical theory ideology. So the critical theory divides the masses into two categories.
Okay.
Oppressors and victims. So just think about that. Today, what do we have? We have oppressors and victims. That's always the battle. It's always somebody fighting the oppressors or the man. And that goes back to the 1960s.
Yeah.
Okay.
And they always put a hero in the mix that's going to come and save you from the oppressor.
Right. That's right.
I don't know if that's part of it, but it seems like there's always a guy in a white horse. It's always a guy going to come galloping in to save us all from some
Donald
party.
Trump.
Yeah, exactly.
Elon Musk.
Exactly.
Okay, these are the guys that are going to ride in, like you said, Pete, on the white horse.
Yeah.
And they're going to do battle on your behalf. You don't need to do anything. You know, you can tweet all day long. That's fantastic. Continue to tweet.
If you're allowed.
But let Elon and Donald Trump and whoever else, let them take the bad guys on.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. And folks, what you have to understand is all of these people, Musk, Trump, they are all part of the controlled system. They're all part of it. The very system that oppresses you is not going to magically become unoppressed and free you. It's just not going to happen. Okay. No, so
I completely agree. Yeah.
Their premise is to keep your head in their system. So the political system is a uniparty. It's one system. And they play off of each other as if there's two distinct factions out there. But at the end of the day, they're one and the same with the same goals. And I've tried to explain this to many people, Peter, over the years. We did not get to where we are today with the system because two parties were fighting each other. Two parties were working together with each other behind the scenes to move the ball forward while giving the perception that there are differences.
Well, if I'm not mistaken, our original government back in the 1700s was there weren't parties. I don't think George Washington was a Democrat and Jefferson was a Republican. I don't think they did. I don't think they believed in a party system back then.
Yeah, you might be correct. I'm trying to remember going back. I did some reading about that years ago, but in either case, what we have today, whether they had parties or not back then, today it's just one big club.
Yeah.
And we're not in it. I mean, just take a look at everything that goes on, all of the crimes that are committed. and nobody's held accountable.
Oh, exactly.
Nobody's held accountable. So critical theory, which came out of the Frankfurt School, again, divides the masses into two categories, oppressors and victims. And the intent was to destabilize society and to destroy the, quote, oppressive order. So one of the ways they did this was through feminism. So let me give this example. So they want to eliminate the traditional family nucleus because that's in the way of this one world communist state. And so what they did was there was two things. There was a war on man, on the male, and it was also a war on women. And people think, well, a war on women, yes. So going back to the very beginning of time, the traditional family nucleus consisted of the husband or the father, which was the provider and safety, the hunter, and so on, provider. And we had the wife or the mother who would take care of the children and maintain the home. And so there was that synergy.
Yeah.
And it's traditional, and it's not just traditional here in the United States. It goes back through the beginning of time, through all cultures.
Sure.
Now, some people might want to argue that in certain family dynamics, it was somewhat different. That's okay. It's okay if it's somewhat different, as long as the balance is reached and there's an agreement between the man and the woman, the husband and the wife, or whatever, that's how they're going to work it. But the cultural Marxists, the Frankfurt School, were not interested in a balance. They weren't interested in an agreed upon dynamic. So what they did with feminism was they turned around and they went to women. It was a full-fledged propaganda war on women. And they said to them, look, why are you home taking care of the kids?
Yeah.
Why are you doing that? Why are you interested in taking care of the house? Why are you doing that as your husband gallivants off to work and he's making money and he's able to go traveling or whatever, the husband did for a living. So what they did was, this is going back to the Bertrand Russell quote where they're going to convince people that snow is black. Critical theory basically is gaslighting. It's getting you to believe something, a belief that you have is not a valid belief. Because a lot of women back in the day were saying, well, look, I'm perfectly happy being home, taking care of the household, caring for the children. I'm perfectly satisfied with doing that. So a lot of women were pushing back on this. And they just kept at it and kept at it and kept at it. And that's when they started with women's lib and getting women into the workplace. Because as soon as they were able to do that, that allowed the family to begin to disintegrate. Now, the mother was out of the house. The father was out of the house because he was working. That would lead to the children going to preschool care, going to school during the day, after school care. So the children then had limited interaction with their biological parents, essentially almost becoming wards of the state. And so there was now influences on the children where the kids can be conditioned and propagandized with curriculums, whether it be in school or outside of school, to start to shape their minds. And the other thing that they did was, in order to get the women out of the ladies out of the house, was to create an economic and financial situation where it became so expensive to be able to own a home, right? Because back in the day when I was a kid, my mother stayed home. She cared for the children. Dad went to work. And in fact, Dad had basically two jobs. One was like a part-time job, but he had a full-time job and a part-time job. But we had a nice house on Long Island. We were, basically blue-collar, middle class.
Sure.
And we were able to live that way. But then, as time went on, future generations could not afford to have that type of home on one income.
No.
It couldn't happen. So that's the other thing that they did. So they have multiple levers. They have levers where they're just psychologically, screwing with people's heads and telling you, do you really want to be a mother? Do you really want to, watch kids? Do you really want to go to PTA meetings? Do you really want to do this? Don't you want to be in the workforce? Don't you want to make the same money? And then while they're doing that, they're altering the economic and financial landscape to make it necessary for the woman, in many cases, to have to go to work.
And if you look at the condition of our country, just in the United States, the violence and the kids that are killing each other and shooting up schools, and how it's just had this horrible effect because there's nobody at home now.
Right.
Because both parents are working. The kids are losing their minds.
Right.
And you can see where it's headed. They're trying to steer us towards, okay, things are too expensive. Now, I have a feeling they're trying to push us towards this socialistic economy where the government takes care of everybody.
Yeah.
And we're all just like, oh, okay, yeah, if you want to give me a couple $1,000 a month, I'll be fine with that. But that was just a thought I had there.
No, that's exactly where they're taking this, Peter. They're taking this to the point where, look, at the end of the day, eugenics did not go away. So depopulation is a very big item on their agenda. We'll talk about that in a little bit, because it's getting to the point where a lot of people are no longer productive in society. They're counterproductive. They're into decadence. They're into inane activities, so they're not contributing to the benefit or the health of society or the culture. They're not contributors.
No.
So, and this is being done by design. And at some point, like I said, we're going to see declines in the population. That's my personal belief. And I think the March 2020 event was a way to kick that off. So critical theory dissects existing societal beliefs and criticizes them in a way to redefine existing beliefs. So existing beliefs, values, and morals, which were imposed by governments, religions, etc., as oppressive, thus inhibiting human potential. So they criticize it, saying that the reason why you believe what you believe and you do what you do is because it's been imposed upon you by governments and religions. It's not because it's inherent to, it's not instinctual to your thinking. It's because somebody told you had to do it that way. Now, that's not to say that there aren't things that we're told have to be a certain way, but it's also not the case that we don't have instinctual feelings and understandings of right and wrong, as an example, of what's the right way to raise a family. And the right way to raise a family is to ensure that we have as much attention at home as we possibly can with the children, and the proper education, and to be taught proper etiquette and manners, and for the mother and father to be very good role models. Now, I know that, that's a tall order, because everybody's different and everybody has different experiences with their families, myself included. But that's the premise. I mean, that's really what we should be striving for. We should be striving for that. We should be striving for a more intellectual, more philosophical, a society that is based more on going with their instincts, their God-given instincts and reasoning, than all of this crap that's just being funneled through our television sets and dumped into our living rooms and just dumbing everything down. So that's the thing. So again, victims and oppressors. So with critical theory and the Frankfurt School, the oppressors are the government. It's the fascist state. You'll hear the Frankfurt School talk about fascism all the time. Adorno talks about that. He says that at work, people are producers. At home, they are consumers. That's the result of a capitalist fascist state. Now, there's a lot when you look into Theodore Adorno. There's a lot that Adorno says that, I mean, it makes sense. It resonates to a point. But then you have to take a step back and say, okay, well, Adorno said the following things. I'll take you through some of the things that he said.
Okay.
Okay. But then you have to lay it up against, okay, he said that. Now, where are we today? So what he was talking about didn't really transpire. It didn't. So was he gaslighting us at the time? Or was he a person that was altruistic in a way? And, let's just say, I'll play devil's advocate, that he didn't have the full understanding of where things were ultimately going down later on down the line, decades down the line. Mm-hmm. So maybe at his point in time when he was talking about this stuff, he actually believed this stuff, and he thought that maybe he could help move humanity in a better direction. Maybe. Okay. So I don't want people to go all nuts thinking I'm defending the Frankfurt School or Theodore Adorno. I'm just saying that, I wasn't there. I wasn't in the man's head. All I could do is read the things that he said, and I could build a case to say that maybe that's where he was at. Although I could also make a case that says now 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the line, the stuff he was talking about really didn't transpire.
So he was part of the Frankfurt School.
Yes.
Okay.
Adorno was part of the Frankfurt School with Max Horkheimer, who I read that quote before, another guy by the name of Herbert Marcuse, and also Erich Fromm. We'll talk a little bit about Adorno in just a moment here. So the Frankfurt School recommended the creation of racial divides, continual change to create confusion, and we see this all the time. So going back to something as simple as masks work, masks don't work. Masks work, masks don't work. This was the Fauci bit. Yeah. Right? Going back and forth. This is creating confusion. Yeah. Teaching sex and alternative sexual lifestyles to children. We see that in spades today. Undermining the authority of the schools and the teachers, promoting excessive drinking and drugs, emptying the churches. Again, this is the war on Christianity. In Memoirs, it tells us that the Illuminati or the controllers declared war on Christianity on September 11th of 1962. That's when they formally put the stake in the ground and they said, okay, we're going to dismantle Christianity. The Frankfurt School advocated creating an unreliable legal system with victim bias, dependency on the state, controlling the media to dumb down, and encouraging the breakdown of the family. They promoted pansexualism, and this goes back to the cult of Pan. And when we talk about promoting pansexualism, we're talking about the search for pleasure and overthrowing traditional relationships, going back and breaking down the family and the traditional relationship between a man and a woman and their children. They also were advocates of marginalizing the role of the father. So they wanted to abolish male, quote, dominance because men oppress women. That's their propaganda. Men oppress women. And so therefore, again, we're going back to the oppressor-victim discussion. Yeah. They advocated removing the parents as the primary educators. We talked about that. And obfuscate the difference between genders. In fact, there's a quote by Erich Fromm, who was one of the members of the Frankfurt School, and he said he was an active advocate of the matriarchal theory, and he was quoted as saying that masculinity and femininity, he claimed they were not reflections of, quote, essential sexual differences. So masculinity and femininity were not reflections of essential sexual differences, as the Romantics had thought, but were derived instead from differences in life functions, which were in part socially determined. Okay, again, so we're back to snow is black. This type of thinking. They also said that the use of music can be used to promote mental illness and destroy society.
Yeah.
Verses or lyrics that were set to music and repeatedly intoned are very effective. So lyrics that were repeated over and over and over again was a form of hypnosis. It was a form of indoctrination and brainwashing. Adorno had said that they could promote a culture of pessimism and despair via radio and television. And this is something that we see all the time. Anybody who sits down and watches the cable news networks like CNBC, MSNBC, Fox News, CNN, and so on, nothing ever positive comes out of that screen, ever. Nope. Everything is pessimistic. Everything is violence and war and upheaval. It's done to create stress and anxiety and worries in your life.
Now, about Adorno, you've touched on him a little bit here, but in his studies, his published studies, on the surface, he claims he was anti-pop culture.
Yeah.
He was an avant-garde musician that wrote atonal music, not pop music.
Right.
So they portray him on the surface as being against all this stuff.
Right.
When in fact, I think he used this is my theory, he used this stuff in conjunction with the Frankfurt School and Tavistock to alter society.
Yes.
Because he was aware of the psychological implications of music and all the things you just mentioned.
Right. So what he did was, because that question comes up a lot. People will say, well, Adorno was not a fan of pop music or jazz. What he did, though, was he leveraged that music to push forward the Frankfurt School's cultural Marxist agenda. This, quote, egalitarian end state that Max Horkheimer was quoted as talking about. So if we take the Beatles as an example, so the Beatles started off very pop oriented, right? They're beginning their early songs going back to Please Please Me and With the Beatles, pretty much straightforward rock and roll. But if we take a look at the evolution of their music from Please Please Me, which was released in March of 1963, up through, let's just pick Revolver, their seventh album, and we take a look at how the music moved and changed in sophistication, that, in my opinion, that is the direct influence of Theodor Adorno shaping the music to move it into a certain direction so that it will support the Cultural Revolution. So it would support the counterculture.
And it moved into more of an atonal, a lot of Lennon's and Harrison's too, moved into more of an avant-garde genre and very strange and out of left field type of music.
Right.
Whereas Paul and Ringo is not really a factor altogether, but Paul's was still, his progression got more orchestrated and elaborate.
Right. And if we go to like Revolution number 9, when you think about that, that's avant-garde atonal in a way. That's a collage of stuff.
Yeah.
Right. And then you got Lennon in his solo career with Yoko Ono and the avant-garde, and really, again, atonal types of. It's in that realm of atonal. It's not tonal. It doesn't have a core. It's all over the place. So, folks, if you're not familiar with atonal music, a best example would be listen to an old horror movie where the piano was just all over the place. I'm just, right. That's a good example of atonal music.
If you want a good example of making everybody think things are black, Yoko Ono's music and John Lennon's Yoko Ono's music, for the life of me, they've been trying to convince me,
right,
as I was a child, that her screaming into a microphone is where it's at when it comes to avant-garde. And and I'm like, there is no way you can ever convince me that a woman screaming to a microphone is music. But they've desperately tried to tell us that music like that is music. Right. I think that's just an example to pull the Beatle crowd in. That's
a perfect example. It's a perfect example, and It was even Lennon was advocating that, pushing, how brilliant she was and that she was ahead of her time, and very few people really understood Yoko Ono's genius. It's the same thing, Pete, with the CIA created modern art. They knew that modern art was just a bunch of nonsense. So if we just put, a canvas up and somebody throws 3 dots of red paint on it,
Yeah.
right, and you're told that that's brilliant. And people would look at it and stare at it in museums and go, just those 3 dots, or just, I don't know how he did it. Well, that was the CIA. That was another psychological operation to get people to think irrationally, because a rational person would look at a white canvas with 3 dots and say, are you kidding me? That's a white canvas with 3 drops of paint on it. I'm moving on. I'm going down to, to the diner to get a sandwich.
Yeah.
But it got people into this mindset where they were accepting irrational, illogical situations and presentations and embracing them.
Well,
so Adorno, when you think about what Adorno, and I do believe Adorno was he was in a position, a very, very influential position with the Beatles music, working with George Martin. I think if I had to say the way I think the organizational structure worked, I think George Martin reported in to Theodore Adorno. That's how I think it worked. That's just my opinion. And so when we think about what we were talking about before, the progression of the Beatles music, starting with Please Please Me, and with the Beatles, very basic stuff. And then when you start getting into Help and then Revolver, in fact, with Revolver, the take on that was, now the Beatles are moving more into music that doesn't make you move, it makes you think. It's thinking person's music. And then, of course, we get into, that's Rubber Soul. I think I said Rubber Soul, I hope. Then we get into Revolver. And then from Revolver, of course, we get into Sgt. Pepper. But that was all table setting. And Sgt. Pepper, of course, kicked off the psychedelic era, and drugs, free love. And anytime there's a discussion about the Beatles, a documentary, and I know you can attest to this, they will almost always talk about how influential the Beatles were to culture change.
Oh, absolutely.
So it was everything. It was the music. It was the way they dressed. It was even the way they spoke. And Tavistock creates all of these genres, Pete, as you know. And even if bands were not in on the PSYOP per se, in other words, bands were signed or recruited, the thing is they operated within that genre's parameters. So in other words, let's just say classic rock as an example. So they would come in and they play within that genre of music, classic rock or the British Invasion.
Mm-hmm.
It's a process of emulation. So they didn't actually have to be schooled in what the end game goal is of the New World Order or the control system, the One World Order. A lot of these bands, they were put in a position where they emulated the style of music. They emulated the lyrics. They emulated the singing. They emulated the way the music was presented, whether it be the way they dressed or the way the album covers were reflective of occult symbolism and stuff like that. Because I get that question a lot too. People will say, well, every single band was, signed on a dotted line on this thing. I said, no, not every single band. There were key instrumental bands that were leading the way. And yes, they were in on it. But
you have to understand, like most people don't know, when you get signed to a label, the label takes over and tells you how to dress.
Yes.
They tell you what songs are going to be in the album. They tell you what key they're going to be in. I think the big producers who are run by something else manipulate the sound to make it more.
That's absolutely right. So
yeah,
the labels are all tied into the music and entertainment industry. It's all controlled. Yeah. And the music and entertainment industry is controlled from cradle to grave, from beginning to end. So if you're going to be in that system one way or another, you are going to lose your voice. You are going to lose a level of your creativity and your vote or your voice in what goes on. Because at the end of the day, they're going to present it this way. Look, this is a business. It's our business. And we're going to tell you how you've got to put this together, because whether you like to hear it or not, Mr. or Mrs. Band or artist, you are a product. And so, so a lot of these entertainers and these musicians and these bands, they go from this whole well, we're musicians and we're all about creativity, to being told directly or indirectly by the music industry, by the labels, you're a product. Mm-hmm. It's as simple as that. And at the drop of a hat, they will bring in whoever they need to bring in, musician-wise, to record on the track. So if you're the guitar player in a band and you put a guitar track down, the producer sits down and says, "Yeah, I don't think so. I've got a guy that I want to lay down that guitar track because he or she's a much better guitar player, or I've worked with them before." Maybe it's just a matter of I've worked with them before. And exactly. There's even, it's interesting because there are even people who have YouTube channels who are in, music YouTube channels, and they're producers. Oh, yeah. I'm not going to say who they are.
Yeah, I know some of them. Yeah.
Yeah. And even I watch their shows, because I love the musical aspect of it as a musician.
Sure. Yeah.
But even they have said that they have brought people in to re-record tracks. They've hired other musicians. They've hired songwriters to write music for a particular band so that they can create content for their albums or whatever it is they're going to release. So boy, we really got off on a tangent there, or I did.
Sorry.
But that's okay. No, but what Adorno did was Adorno used the Beatles. He leveraged them, right? So he leveraged the existing system, if you will, the existing pop music. And it was very ingenious. Him and George Martin, what they did was very genius. They continued to evolve it over time until it got to the point where it was extremely effective in changing societal norms, in creating culture change.
Let me stop you. So how did, let's say Martin reported to Adorno. Initially, Martin didn't like the Beatles. He didn't like their music. Right. He thought they were crap.
Rubbish.
So they decided somehow they blackmailed Martin or did something, got him to, but how did they know this was going to work and become the phenomenon that it became? That's where, did they see something in these guys and their sound?
No,
I think make the sound.
The decision was made several notches up the chain. So I think George Martin started working with EMI Parlophone in 1955. And by the time he was 29 years old, he was handed the label to run the Parlophone label. Parlophone is a part of EMI. And initially, I'm not convinced that George Martin was brought into the loop as to what the Beatles were going to be used for initially. Because the way it works, Pete, it's all compartmentalized. It's a need-to-know basis. Mm-hmm. So there are people that were developing all of this above George Martin that were formulating how they were going to make major changes in society through music. So,
So the Beatles, who went, well, it couldn't have been the initial four, but the band may have been handpicked even when they were kids, right?
Yeah.
When they were first musicians, said, hey, these four guys, they come from this background. Lennon's perfect to manipulate his mind because he's had trauma. Paul had trauma. He lost his mother to breast cancer. I think they looked for broken people. Ringo had been hospitalized as a kid. He was kind of shattered by his childhood being so sick. Could it be they looked for people that were very susceptible to a suggestion?
Yes, and families that are somehow connected into the system.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So now, interestingly enough, if you go on the internet and you try to find a lot of information on Paul McCartney, biological Paul McCartney's father, Jim McCartney, you're not going to find a lot, which is very strange because here we have the father of arguably one of the most famous musicians of all time.
Yeah.
And there's essentially very little on Jim McCartney.
No.
Now, in memoirs, it tells us that Jim McCartney was steering his son away from Christianity. So that's a little hint there that something was going on. Now, I'll get back to this in a second here.
Okay.
But you're on a good point, especially like with Lennon. Lennon had a lot of trauma. He lost his mother, who was raised by his Aunt Mimi. His father, Freddie, was nowhere to be found. A lot of people also don't realize that John Lennon really had a dislike for Christianity early on in his life. There's some stories in the book, The Lennon Prophecy. It's a book I read. The author's name is Joseph Niezgoda. And some of the stories that Joseph relays in his book are actually quite disturbing as far as Lennon's dislike for Christianity. We also have these, and I've mentioned this on a number of shows, we have these images of the Beatles, primarily Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and John Lennon, associated with bird cages. Now, bird cage symbolism in Illuminati speak refers to mind control subjects. So I have images where Paul McCartney and George Harrison have the bird cages on their heads. And then I have another image of John Lennon in a Superman shirt leaning up against the side of a bird cage. Now, the Superman shirt is interesting because that goes back to Crowley and that goes back to Nietzsche, and it's referred to as the Übermensch, the superhuman. And this is something else that the controllers are very much into, the development of the superhuman, the transcendent human.
And Superman was written here in Cleveland by two Jewish men.
Yes.
And it's basically a Jewish story of, I can't remember the exact story, but it's nothing about Krypton and all that stuff. It's about Moses or something. It's a lot of Jewish symbolism in Superman that they don't talk about. But I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, that's okay. So we have to. So when I see this type of symbolism, what comes to mind is that the Beatles, in all likelihood, going back to your point, they were in. It's possible they were in some kind of program early on in their lives, and that they were being handled and groomed. Of course, now when you're a young kid, you're unaware of this stuff, but you are being handled and you are being groomed, and you are having experiences and you are doing things which culminate to a certain point in your life when the switch is thrown and you're brought in for the next phase or the next stage of what's going to go on. And so I believe there was a whole phase with the Beatles being groomed and handled prior to going to Hamburg. And once they got to Hamburg, that was another phase or another stage of their grooming and their handling. I mean, when we think about, they connected with Stuart Sutcliffe, right? We're told, had a relationship with Astrid Kircher, the photographer. Well, she connects up with the Beatles. I think it was in late 1960s. And she starts taking all of these artsy photos of the Beatles. But back during that time period, when the Beatles hit Hamburg back in August of 1960, they were a non-entity. They were not good musicians. They weren't writing songs. So I see this again as table setting. This is the type of thing that takes place where certain people are introduced into the equation in order to create the backstory. Right? It's the same thing with Klaus Vormann.
Yes.
Okay. And if we take if you want to pick on another band, Tom Petty. I remember watching a documentary on Tom Petty when Petty was nobody. There was still all of this footage, video footage, film footage of him when he was not on anybody's radar. So who was like, why is somebody following him around
Yeah.
filming him when, the chances that he was going to become famous is, is like anybody else. I mean, it's
Yeah.
a 1,000,000 to 1 shot, right? I mean, I'm talking
Yeah.
about from a public perspective. Of course, if he's on
Sure.
somebody's radar, it's not 1,000,000 to 1.
Yeah.
So you have to start asking yourselves that question. Gordon Lightfoot was another one. I remember watching a documentary on Gordon Lightfoot, and when he was up in Canada and he was doing his shows in these bars and doing his gigs, there was all of this film footage of him, Peter, and really artsy types of footage where they're shooting from the ground up.
Oh, really?
Certain angles. And, I was watching this with my wife, and the question we asked ourselves is, who's filming this, and why are they filming this? So this is the type of stuff that we see, and it's difficult for a lot of people to get their heads wrapped around, because people just can't think in terms of that much planning that far in advance. But there is that much planning that far in advance. And like I said, because many times the families of these people are somehow or usually tied in to the system, into the military, as an example, into intelligence.
Exactly.
So anyway, boy, oh boy, I really took us off on a little ride there.
I took you off the trail okay. You're on.
So anyway, I think going back to what you were saying about Adorno, he wasn't a fan of pop music and all that stuff, but he was leveraging it. He was leveraging it in order to be able to push the agenda forward. He was not going to be able to push the agenda forward by coming out with atonal music and then trying to get people to enjoy it, like it, play it, buy it. That was never going to happen. Atonal music is very, very difficult, in my opinion, to enjoy. Yeah. It's very, it has a lot of tension, a lot of stress. It doesn't have moments of release. And so it's not anything enjoyable to listen to. So what he did was he leveraged the existing system to push the ball forward. Now, Frankfurt's network extends into eugenics. I talked about the Fabians before, population control, sexual and family law reforms. It's linked to publishing houses, medical and educational and research establishments, women's organizations, marriage counseling, governments, etc. So the Frankfurt School, like Tavistock, are embedded within the very fabric of our institutions within society. And the Frankfurt School and Tavistock are connected at the hip, as well as Tavistock was also a highly financed, still is to this day, by the Rockefellers. And the CIA is one of Tavistock's largest clients.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yes. So again, folks, these books, Coleman's book on Tavistock, he goes through a lot of this, and Daniel Eschulin's book, I can only do so much as far as taking you through this stuff. But yeah, so that's the deal with Theodore Adorno. I've struggled with Adorno a little bit, Peter, because like I said, was there this piece of him that there was an altruistic aspect of him where he actually thought that he was going to somehow achieve the goals of the human potential movement of the 1960s with Willis Harman, who was was a peer of Theodore Adorno's, and Willis Harman was behind the human potential movement and the Aquarian conspiracy. The Aquarian conspiracy was what was behind the counterculture of the 1960s. So I don't know, but it certainly didn't work out that way. And so when we go from the Frankfurt School, and another connection point leading into the Beatles, I mentioned earlier, was the Beat movement. So the Beat movement were cultural Marxists as well. And three primary players, there were more, but there was William S. Burroughs, who is on the cover of Sgt. Pepper, Allen Ginsberg, and Jack Kerouac. And the members of the Beat generation developed a reputation as new bohemian hedonists who celebrated nonconformity and spontaneous creativity. Now, the spontaneous creativity goes back to the cult of Pan. So all mixed up in this cultural Marxism, Pete, is the cult of Pan and the cult of Dionysus. Basically, do as thou wilt. If it feels good, do it. And we have the Nike tagline, just do it. So it all goes back to that as well. And elements of the Beat movement were incorporated into the hippie and larger counterculture movements. And the Beats had a pervasive influence on rock and roll and popular music, including the Beatles, Bob Dylan, and Jim Morrison. The Beatles spelled their name with an A, partly as a Beat generation reference.
I never connected that.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, goes back to the Beats. Also, the beetle goes back to the scarab beetle of Egyptian mythology, because the Egyptian scarab beetle is associated with enlightenment. And John Lennon was a fan of Jack Kerouac. And as I mentioned, the Beatles put William S. Burroughs on the cover of the Sgt. Pepper album.
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, that again led us into the Beatles. And the Beatles were really the first manufactured band to come out with a full-fledged mission of social engineering. They were the bedrock, and other genres were built upon the Beatles. Even genres which people think are completely unrelated. The Beatles are the foundation of the house. So your roof may not look like your basement, but without that basement, you wouldn't have the roof.
It's all connected.
It's all connected. Yes.
Well, I think what I've always wondered is I said when we first met, is why did the Beatles have such an influence on me? How did they take me by the throat as an 8-year-old kid, and I couldn't look away? And, I wondered if there's anything in the music, especially newer music, where there's some type of hidden tone, like a Hertz or something that makes it hypnotic, because I listened to Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young's album. They're one of their first albums. And I, as a grown man, I can't listen to it, because every time I hear it, I go into like I'm high. Like I'm just like, whoa. I'm like, oh, this is not right. Why would this music do this to me? And I've always wondered, what is it about this genre that took young people's mind like mine and just totally threw me? I mean, I was off in the woods until I was in my 30s, obsessed with the Beatles. I mean, if you met any of my family or friends from that era, they would tell you I was a lunatic for the Beatles. And I would get into fights with people that they were the best band. And do you know of anything that's in the music itself that they've put into not just their music, that is hypnotic in such a way? Since you've done hypnosis, is there any way to break the tracks apart or hear a tone that's buried in the mix that is like a dog whistle? I know that's on Sgt. Pepper's, but
I don't know about I don't know of a way to identify which frequencies have been put into the music to elicit some kind of response. Now, Alan Watt, the musician and the truth seeker, not the other Alan Watt.
Okay, yeah.
Alan had a quote of his. He was actually not a quote, but it was an interview. And at the end of my follow-up to my big presentation, did the Beatles write all their own music? I did a follow-up titled The Addendum. At the very end, I had an interview. It was about 5 or 6 minutes of Alan. He explained, now I don't know how Alan knew this, but he said that George Martin was an expert in incorporating sound frequency into music.
Seriously?
Yes.
You just, I just was pulling that out of my backside. So,
no,
I'm onto something?
Yeah, you're onto something. So
okay.
he talked about this, and And like I said, I don't know how Alan knows this. So this tells us, if Alan is correct, and I suspect he probably is, this tells us what I've always suspected, that George Martin was more than just a producer. He was, in my view, a social engineer, a social scientist, working with Theodore Adorno, perhaps even working with, like I mentioned before, Willis Harman, who was behind the human potential movement. And you'll read about Willis Harman in the memoirs of Billy Shears. He gets notable mention a couple of times in the book.
Okay.
So I think all of these guys, Pete, were they were all on the same page, and they were all working for the same company with the exact same objectives. And the way the Masonic system works is it's a pyramid structure. It's like a big corporation. Think of it as Masonic Incorporated or Freemasonry Incorporated. And
you have a chart there of that, don't you?
I have a chart. I have a chart that I don't have it here with me right now, but
okay.
A person by the name of Dylan Monroe, I stumbled upon this going back about 2 months ago, and he put together a pyramid of power. It's a hierarchy, and he did a phenomenal job of it. There's 5 tiers and placing who's where in that tier, everywhere from the mass population at the very bottom of the pyramid, up through the corporations, up through the international structures like the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, and all that stuff, up through the secret societies like the Freemasons, going up into the Vatican. And by the way, he shows that Aleister Crowley's religion of Thelema, which is Luciferianism, which is the cult of Pan, is very high up that pyramid, as I had surmised by doing my own research. So I was very happy to see that I don't know Dylan at all. I just happened to come across his work when he placed Thelema that high up into the 3rd tier of the pyramid. I said, well, there you go, So, so this pyramid, the way it works is, like I said, it's just like a corporation. Whenever there's a project or there's an initiative or there's some kind of an agenda that needs to get done, they tap their resources, their network, for the best skilled people to pull together whatever it is they're looking to do. And that's what I think happened with George Martin. So I think initially George was not brought into the fold because at that point, there was not a need to know. But the Beatles, unbeknownst to him, were being brought along by levels above him. And so when it was time to bring the Beatles in under his wing, that's when he was told, you're going to take them on. And not only are you going to take them on, but you're going to be instrumental in creating what they became. Because without George Martin, the Beatles, they were going nowhere fast. And I've covered this on so many shows without getting into it. Yeah,
Well, I think the thing that makes it seem like they were manufactured is because when you hear the early recordings in Hamburg, the crowd is like, "Oh yeah, great," but I'm supposed to believe that was just an off night. No. But come on. I mean, they were average at best, doing shimmy, shimmy, shake, and all that stuff. I'm just like, that has to be. Somebody had to go, I don't care what they look like now, we're going to make them into something.
Yes.
It just seems like they were plucked out of. There's no way, of all the bands that were in Hamburg and in Liverpool and England, that they just happened to get lucky. It just doesn't seem possible.
Yeah, and we have to keep in mind that the Beatles went to Hamburg in August of 1960, and they were known as a bum group. And this is explained by their manager at the time, their handler, Alan Williams, in The Complete Beatles from the 1980 documentary, which was considered the Beatles documentary until Anthology was released. And so from August through December of 1960, the Beatles basically banged around Hamburg, It was the red light district. There was lots of booze. There was lots of drugs. There was lots of prostitution. In fact, again, the book Lenin Prophecy, Joseph Niezgoda goes into this. The Beatles were treated for sexually transmitted diseases, STDs, and they left Hamburg in December of 1960 completely dejected because nothing happened. Nothing happened.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And it didn't pick up until 1961. And you and I talked about this on our first show when, all of a sudden they start getting all of these gigs and they're getting booked left and right, whether it be back in Hamburg or back home in Liverpool and adjacent areas. And this is a band that really had phenomenal skills musically.
Yeah, exactly.
And no songwriting ability, Pete. I have a quote from George Martin where he said that it was not evident, it was not obvious, that they were songwriters. So, there's so much with the Beatles story. There's so much that the thing is, but when you talk about this, you're one of the very small percentage of people that actually are objective and have an open mind to this stuff. So many people just absolutely shut it down because, like I said earlier, what does Tavistock create? It creates cults, and nobody wants their cult belief system to be questioned. Nobody.
Oh, I know.
Nobody. And it's a shame too, because I try to explain to folks, it's okay to question it. Your life will be okay afterward. It really will be.
Well, I think the thing with me is I started thinking about some of the music of theirs when I was a kid that I didn't like I've told you, Love Me Do. That song, if it dropped off the face of the earth, the world would be a better place. But when I was little, I talked myself into going, yeah, I love this song. And even songs I couldn't stand, like Tomorrow Never Knows and Number 9, I eventually was like, oh, this is amazing.
Yeah.
I'm like, wait a minute, what happened? And it's like cigarettes or booze. When you have your first beer, my first beer tastes like crap. And I didn't want to drink it again, but I could laugh and be more lighthearted and hit on girls. It's just like you talk yourself into liking garbage.
Yes.
And I don't know if that's all part of the process, but I also noticed that I've got a 2019 Subaru Forester. Every time I turn on the ignition, the radio comes on. I'm like, why? Why does the radio have to come on to the last song, last station I listened to? And I thought, and then we were at a mall over on the east side of Cleveland, and everywhere you went in this mall, there was music outside, and it's an outdoor mall. There's speakers on the sidewalk. You hear classic rock all over the place. You go in the stores, classic rock all over the place. Like, why are we constantly awash in music in this culture, and CNN and Fox and the airports? And I started to question all this. I'm like, well, wait a minute. Why do we constantly have to be barraged with music and messages? And we're now walking. Well, this isn't a billboard. You've got your Gretsch hat on. No offense to you and Gretsch, but we're walking billboards. They've got us promoting their agenda with logos, the Nike logo or Reebok or whoever it is. And I was like, what? Nobody else notices it. Everyone else, so what? Your radio turns on when you turn on the car. Just turn it off. But that's not the point. There's a reason why they do that.
Why is it doing right? That's
right. I don't think it's by coincidence or convenience. So
people have to stop thinking in terms of coincidence all the time.
Oh yeah.
I mean there are coincidences. I mean, there's no question. But the thing is, it's about pattern recognition, and we do have to take a step back and take a look at where the world is at. And you have to ask yourself the question: be honest with yourself. Be objective and say, do you like what you see? Does this seem normal to you? And it's, I'll answer from my perspective. No, it is not normal. There's a tremendous amount of dysfunction and decadence, and it's completely upside down. The entire political system is a clown show.
Oh yeah. It's really bad.
It's really bad, and people are still playing in it. People are still cheering it on and believing in it. And I don't know. People who are critical thinkers, people who could think clearly, they're a very small percentage of the population. And a lot of times we sound like lone wolves, howling at night.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Nobody wants to hear when we say, hey, I don't know about that guy or whatever. People don't want to hear it. People love to worship. They love to follow. They want to have their heroes.
Yeah.
That's what they want. That's what they want.
And I've got a podcast on Mind Revolution where I say, be your own hero, because no one's coming to save you.
No.
Donald Trump is not going to save us or keep illegals out. I mean, he didn't do it the first time. Why does anybody think he's going to do it this time? I just don't understand. I hate to pick on my wife, but she watches these reality TV shows. And they come on, and I tell her, I say, there's a whole camera crew that these women, do you ever watch New Jersey Housewives or any of those horrible shows? It's just these really horribly done up women with plastic implants and boobs hanging out. And they bitch and scream at each other and cry and get drunk and all this stuff. And I said to Meg, I said, there's a whole camera crew behind the scene here. This is not reality. There's grips and gaffs and cameramen and producers and sound techs. There's no way it's spontaneous. And if they don't do it right the first time, they say, cut. Okay, Gene, say that, call that girl a prostitution whore with more intensity. All right, let's do it again. And she's like, yeah, I know that, but I just like watching it. Mm-hmm. And when you watch her watch it, it's like she becomes a child.
Yes.
I watch, she goes into this little world, and I just sit and watch her. I just horrified at, how she's so bedazzled by these TV shows, and her mother watches them too.
Remember what I told you, that one of their tactics is to reduce adult thinking to a childlike state.
Yeah. I mentioned that when we did the last interview about all the cartoon animals they used to entertain us with insurance companies and things like that.
And we talked about the Beatles Now and Then video, which looked like it was, it was like a Sesame Street episode. It was all this silly, goofy stuff. And if you watch the comments and read the comments under that video, it's amazing. You have adults just fawning over this stuff and reacting like children and writing out childlike comments. It's just absurd.
Yeah, they're in tears. They're choked up. They're verklempt because they've got, and I used to be I still get like that over some music.
Yeah.
But more of my stuff is with Clapton and his blues solos that really moved me. But that's a whole nother thing. But this has been great. I don't know if I got you off track because I kept asking questions.
No, I think we covered just about everything. We got there.
Thanks, everybody, for watching. That was Mike Williams talking about Theodore Adorno, Tavistock, and their connection with the Beatles. I hope you liked this video. Thanks a lot, Mike, for being on the show. It was a great pleasure working with you. And if you like this video, give it the thumbs up, subscribe, share it. The greatest way you can support this channel for free is just to like and subscribe. Thanks a lot for watching. I'm PTPop on a Mind Revolution. Signing off. Auf Wiedersehen, baby.
Would you like fries with that? Would you like fries with that?